Alrighty, so this talk is a talk I gave at B-Side Charlotte. So if you happen to attend B-Side Charlotte, sorry for the repeat. Just feel free to ask me any questions at any point, and we can dive down whatever rabbit hole you guys want to. But essentially, this is a pretty cool pen test that I was able to do very recently of hacking into a hospital in the Pacific Northwest, obviously for non-disclosure agreements, et cetera. I can't tell you exactly who it is, but you can get a good idea of a pretty unique type of penetration test. And so hopefully for those of you who are red teamers, this will kind of give you different ideas or different tactics, things to think about. And then for blue teamers, they'll spend a little bit of time talking about kind of what the underlying vulnerabilities we found were and how to go about fixing those. So basically, what we're going to cover, we already talked about that. Who am I? So I work with Matt at TriExtreme Security. My background is Air Force. So I went to the Air Force Academy, and then from there was a cyber officer in the Air Force for a while. Then I realized I can have a lot more fun in the civilian side. So since then, I've been doing it on the civilian side there. Again, the test here. So this is a hospital in the Pacific Northwest. We started with just an external penetration test in February of 2020. So right when the pandemic kind of kicked off. Initially it was just an external penetration test. We kind of had conversations with them and you'll see why in just a minute, but this quickly turned into from a external penetration test into social engineering and internal penetration test. Those were performed in June and July. So right in the middle of the peak. You can see several states here, but essentially we were in the middle of the peak of the pandemic, and they connected our laptop for the internal penetration test into the ER. So we were literally plugged in just like somebody off the street plugged a computer into the network. Obviously goes kind of without saying, but when I'm plugged into a hospital network in the middle of a pandemic, especially plugged into the ER, availability was really important, right? So I didn't want to do anything that would potentially bring down the network, kind of that balance of giving somebody a good understanding of a test, understanding their risks. Of course, we're going to try to emulate the attacks they're most likely to see, but we wanted to stop short of causing any type of disruption to their network or causing anything that would cause them to be down, especially in the emergency room. So we started again back in February with a external penetration test. And so again, an external penetration test is designed to emulate the risk of a hacker, right? So on the internet, what can I see from the ports and services exposed? I have no permissions, I have no underlying knowledge, and kind of what information can I glean from what's available. So the first thing I noticed is they had an OWA server exposed, right? So this is just their Outlook email login. And for penetration testing, that's a jackpot right there. The reason why is Outlook web interfaces are vulnerable to something called username and time-based username enumeration. And so you can see from this screenshot here, when I'm trying to log in, even if I have an incorrect password, if it's a valid username, it takes less than a second for the server to respond to me saying incorrect. Whereas if it's a invalid username, it'll take 3 seconds because it's looking through its whole database, etc. And so there's tools readily available. This one was just Metasploit that can go through large list of usernames. So with that, we go and we collected a large list of potential usernames, things like LinkedIn, things like just doing crafted Google searches, trying different naming conventions, first dot last, first initial last, et cetera, until I get enough of a data set that I'm like, okay, it's clear these guys are doing first initial last name. So then I run through everybody who's on LinkedIn associated with this hospital. 300 potential employees, narrow that down to 185 valid usernames. And then after that, I'm going to, since this is just first initial last name, that's even easier for me, right? I only have to know really the last name, and I could just cycle through every letter of the alphabet. So I took the 1,000 most common last names and made a script that basically went A through Z for every potential last name. And that brought my password list from about 185 usernames to 250 valid usernames. And so what does that give me besides a list of valid usernames? Well, really nothing, right? But this is a perfect attack platform for something called a password spraying attack. So a password spring attack reverses the paradigm of a traditional password attack, right? So in a traditional password attack, I'm going to take the username that I know, administrator, and try the top 1,000 most common passwords. Really, these days, you're going to run into things like account lockouts. Their alerts are going to be going off, like ringing bells, etc. And so that's not really working very often. You still run into the random clients who are, choosing weak passwords. But when I can get a large list of usernames like this, like the 250 potential usernames, well, now I can do a password spraying attack. And so with that, instead of trying one username with 1,000 most common passwords, I'm going to take as many usernames as I can, for in this instance, about 250 of them. And I'm going to try really weak passwords. So the primary one I used back then was Spring 2020. And so with this case, the end result here after this attack you see on the screen is really just one invalid attempt per user. So that's going to be well below their account lockout threshold. That's also not going to set out any bells and whistles. We've yet to run into a client who have their alerting configured smartly enough to be able to detect this type of attack. And instead of me trying to guess the IT user's password, I'm just guessing the weakest link. And so the reason why Spring 2020 is good is because when you have a password complexity enabled and users have to change their password every 90 days, what you'll see is that users are going to choose Spring 2020, Summer 2020, Fall 2020, Winter 2020. And then they're going to do the same thing for 2021. It helps them to get those past the four remembered passwords, etc. And it's just a really common password that you're going to find. I'd say 60% of larger organizations, somebody will have, Winter 2020 right now. And so finally, you see here, I tried Spring 2020 first. The next thing I tried was Winter 2020, and jackpot. We got one user name who had Winter 2020. And so what does that give me access to? Well, their Office 365 or this Outlook did not have multi-factor authentication on it. So that gave me access to their email. And so I'm looking around in their email, and first and foremost, I see that they're emailing each other protected health information, or EPHI. So patient type data, pretty sensitive type data is being sent back and forth. That's enough for a report right there. But let me try to go another step further. And so the next thing I do is I go to their VPN and I try to log in, and I get hit with a multi-factor authentication prompt, right? So close, but I cannot get access to their internal network. So for all intents and purposes, at this point, I think I'm done. I write up the report. Real quick, how to fix this is, one, this proves why multi-factor authentication is so important, right? So when I logged into the email, there wasn't that multi-factor authentication. And so I was able to gain access to that. But the VPN was protected. So this is a perfect case study on why multi-factor authentication is so important. The other thing that we recommended from this is increasing those passwords, right? Winter 2020 is a terrible password. The problem is, with what I find with most clients is they're focusing on that length and they're focusing on required complexity, but their user awareness training does not do anything for them with choosing password, right? So you guys probably have all seen that comic up here in the top right, but it's so true. So we always recommend doing passphrases. In fact, at Triaxim Security, we have Fortune 300 clients that have a 20-character password policy, and they only require them to change it once a year. And when we do their penetration test, we don't get any of their passwords, at least from this method. We get them from social engineering. But that just demonstrates to you, the importance of getting away from the traditional 8 characters with complexity required and getting more in towards teaching users how to choose strong passwords. If your awareness training doesn't include that, then users are just going to choose your company name 123 or the Spring or whatever it may be. Additionally, there's an increase in emphasis on password blacklists. So for example, Office 365 and Azure AD offer it now, where you can put in lists in a blacklist, and then if anybody has the word, for example, password, or in this case, winter, in their password, it will block them from choosing stupid passwords. Lastly, configure alerts and IP blocking. So what we have seen is that you can throttle the login attempts for that thing like Office 365, such that if one IP address is submitting 5 to 10 attempts in 5 seconds, obviously that's not a valid, legit user case. So you can go ahead and block that IP address. But this is 2020, but wait, there's more, right? So as I'm going through what else is on their external network, one of the things I found was that they had their ServiceNow exposed to the internet. And so they were using ServiceNow for their help desk system. And so again, this one didn't have multi-factor authentication. And so I was able to log in right there, gain access to their multi-factor authentication, or gain access to their help desk. And looking through their help desk, I see this, here's how to set up Mobile Pass on your phone. And so that tells me a pretty good indication of, I know they're using Mobile Pass. Let me see if I can configure that. And so, you know, I already kind of limit it down there. And then the next thing I see is this self-service page. Do you need to replace a lost token? And so I'm looking at this and says, hey, this is required for this hospital's employees to connect externally or on the road. Is this a replacement or lost token? And in black there, I blocked it out, but you know, if you already have Mobile Pass, call the service desk so that we can troubleshoot your email and reset it. So resend the activation email. So what does that mean to me? I told the client that I'm willing to bet that if I called that phone number, they would just send an email to that user's email account. And so as I've already showed you, I had access to their email. So if I can get them to resend a multi-pass authentication link, I just can successfully bypass their multi-factor authentication, thereby giving me access to their VPN. So sure enough, the client said, yeah, that's probably true. Let's check that. And so then we moved on to social engineering. And by this point now it is June. And so social engineering, of course, is doing any type of phone calls or emails to try to entice employees to do something they otherwise wouldn't. So here's our traditional social engineering that we will run at something like Triaxiom. So Google Domains. First, if you go to Google Domains and you look up the name of the company, you can see that there's all sorts of different endings available. So in this case, I obviously looked up the specific hospital, but just looking real quick on Google Domains, I can see hospital.vision's available, hospital.watch, hospital.wiki, etc. In this instance, for this client, I was able to buy their hospital name .training. The prices you see here look high. If you're looking for something a little more specific, for example, when I typed in this hospital's specific name, it cost me $12 to buy the domain for a year. So for $12, I now owned yourhospital.training. And the next thing I do is you can use a bunch of different open source tools out there. So I use GoFish because it gives you some better stats, but there's also Social Engineering Toolkit where you can just clone their website. And so obvious disclaimer that this is just a random one, but I found a login portal that was meant for their employees and I cloned it so that now my website looked exactly like theirs. So now I have a domain and I have an email login portal that looks exactly like yours, and we send them an email and says, hey, we're in the process of setting up a new training portal. This will eventually be our centralized portal for all ongoing training requirements, computer-based training, etc. We're nearing the final stages of the rollout, and as part of the testing process, I've been tasked with reaching out from a sample of people from each department to make sure it's going to work correctly when we roll it out. So to make sure your device is working, please go to this link, sign into that portal that you see every day. You'll receive either a success or error message and respond to the email back to us. On my end, what I see is their username and their password. On their end, what they see is that success message down at the bottom there. And so really, this is just a fake portal designed to gather credentials, again, because that first external penetration test was done in February. And so now we're in June, that user probably reset their password. So for me to even launch that call that help desk and see if I can't get them to reset their password, I had to get some more passwords on their domain. And so that's what this was useful for. Couple just random thoughts for those of you who are interested in social engineering is this campaign can be, varied by 3 different ways. So this first one is the most easy, just send them a success page. That raises the least amount of suspicion and they will just go on about their day thinking they're good. Another variant of this is I can give them to an error page. And so I can just say, hey, there's an error occurred, please respond to the email with error ID 10536, whatever. At that point, they're gonna email me back, and that just gives me a juicy chance to try to do different things, right? So, oh, that's weird, what antivirus are you running? Oh, okay. Hey, can you open your command prompt and type system info and give me a list of everything with your computer, every patch, every information I need from your computer, etc. Or, hey, I'm going to try again, and you might see a multi-factor authentication prompt. If you could just go ahead and give me that number, etc. So that's another variant. And then the third variant, one of my personal favorites, is to redirect them to a system compatibility page. So if you ever go to like Adobe Flash, right, you see they have the, that giant page that you have to scroll forever on of all the compatibility requirements for Adobe Flash. I copy that exact page and put it onto my website. And then at the top, I put a little compatibility checker.exe at the top, and that's just a backdoor. Usually I'll list 2 of them, compatibility checker 1, compatibility checker.2. That allows me to play with them to see if one will get past the antivirus if the other doesn't. That gives me kind of 2 payloads to play with at a time. Of course, if I can get them to download an exe file off the website and run it, I have full control over their computer, right? So that's just kind of 3 variants for you to use. So in this email, I sent it to 500 employees. That is way more than an attacker would normally do, right? The client wanted to test a large population of their employee base. A real world attacker is going to send it to like 5 people at a time, just trying to get one user to fall for it, because it only takes one. Obviously, when I'm sending 500 emails, I'm setting off all sorts of alarm bells for their incident response team, which I wouldn't otherwise do. In this instance, we sent 500 emails. 349 just didn't get open during the time of the test window there. Not too surprising. We're in the middle of a pandemic, and it's a hospital where people are working different shifts, et cetera. We only had it open for about 2 days. 69 of the users they gave us gave us an error that the user, that's an invalid mailbox. 73 users opened the email. Of the 73 users who opened the email, 65 of them submitted the data and gave us their password. So we had 65 user credentials after this. Now, that is, a pretty decent success rate. However, again, kind of another tidbit for social engineering here. If you want to make your campaigns more successful, then add to it phishing or phone-based attacks. And so with this type of attack, I'm going to do the same exact kind of thing I just did, the same campaign. The only thing I'm doing is I'm going to call them first, wait till they respond, then send the email to them, pose as an internal employee, and walk them through. And so generally speaking, our phishing emails like that, a very sophisticated campaign like that would be somewhere around 40% successful. If I'm able to call them, that number jumps to about 80 to 90% success rate. The reason why is when you have them on their phone, they have 2 choices. 1, directly confront you, or 2, go along with it, right? So nobody wants to confront you in person or even over the phone, so they're much more likely to fall for it than they otherwise would be. And so this is a screenshot of Spoof Card, which allows you to spoof your phone number to any phone in the United States. So the only thing I would do is I would spoof to the internal number, call them in that way. And the more open source reconnaissance you can do, the better off you are, right? So if I can find generally what I'm targeting for this is a junior application developer who has recently started with the organization. A, people aren't going to know him that well. And B, maybe I can find more information about him. If I can find his signature block, that's jackpot number 1. If I can find his phone number from that, that's even better. Because then, and this has happened before, I will call users and they will look me up in the employee directory and see that I'm calling from that number, and then boom, they trust you right away. Okay, but that wasn't the purpose of this. Although that was a good test, we still wanted to do it. So the next thing I do is call that number, and sure enough, they said, okay, we're going to send a reactivation request to your email. And so at that point, this is during daytime. So this was kind of a race condition, pretty interesting. I'm sitting there and I'm refreshing this user's mailbox as fast as I can. And I see like all the help desk things coming in. I'm deleting them as fast as I can. Or I actually created a new folder and archived them to that folder. And then marked them as read, hid them as fast as I could. Then from there, I could click on that link, set up mobile pass on my phone, and gain access to their VPN. So now I have internal network access. How do I fix this? 1, MFA. 2, awareness training. Stop providing that generic awareness training, right? So that's kind of a foot stomp for me is if you're just doing the CBT-based awareness training that everybody's doing, your users are just clicking past that. It's wasting your time. It's wasting their time. Nobody's learning anything. What I have found is that when people are thinking about social engineering, most people are thinking of that, comic on the right there, right? The Prince in Nigeria type email, and they're not thinking of really more sophisticated type of attacks. So we encourage our clients, and when we do social awareness training ourselves, we actually walk through the campaign we used with pictures of exactly what they did. Obviously, we anonymize it so nobody gets in trouble or embarrassed, but like, let's show them exactly what a awareness training or exactly what a social engineering is going to look like. Additionally, layer your defenses, right? So there is no silver bullet. As I've just shown, it's able to bypass multi-factor authentication. We have also recently bypassed multi-factor authentication by simply calling the user back and saying, I need that code. You'd be surprised how often that works. So users are always going to be your weakest point. You are never going to get to the point where you're able to get 0% rates on social engineering. It's just not going to happen. So taking that with a grain of salt, layer your defenses, multi-factor authentication, next generation endpoint protection, email filtering. And then finally, the last one there is assume you're compromised. Go through tabletop exercises, assuming you're compromised, and really do a deep dive of what does that mean? How are you going to detect it? Will you detect it? How are you going to respond to it? Work through that. In general, the more tabletop exercises you do for your incident response, the faster and more efficient it works when you actually need it. All right, so now we've proven we can gain internal network access, and we pivoted to an internal penetration test. Again, an internal penetration test assumes that an attacker is on the network. So this could be through social engineering, just like I just mentioned, or this could be through somebody physically walking in off the street and plugging a laptop in. This particular client wanted to make sure that we had it listed there that they plugged the laptop into the ER, just like somebody coming in off the street plugging their own laptop in. So in this instance, it's an exact replication of that risk. Additionally, this takes the risk, emulates the risk of an insider threat, right? So you have somebody who knows they're about to get fired in the next 2 weeks and wants to just cause as much damage, or maybe get some sensitive information, maybe the client list before they leave, right? So internal penetration test starts with their laptop on the internal network, and I go from there to see what I can. The usual type of attacks, for example, NetBIOS name service and local link multicast name resolution was not working in this instance. So for time's sake, I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but this is usually one of the most common ways an attacker can gain access to the network. So in a NetBIOS name service or local link multicast name resolution takes advantage of how Windows computers work. So essentially, when you're trying to connect to a file server over the network, and let's say you mistype it, and you, instead of going to file server 01, you go to typo file server 01. Windows computers by default are going to first check their local host file, which is stored on their computer. Have I talked to typo file server 01 recently? Of course, the answer is no. The next thing it does is step 1 in that diagram is it's going to go to your DNS server. Hey, DNS server, do you know where typo file server 01 is? Again, you mistyped it, so it's going to say, hey, not found. Windows computers by default will do that step 3 there. Shout out to the entire network. Hey, does anybody know where typo file server is 01? What that allows me as an attacker to do is to say, hey, yes, I'm file server 01, connect to me. And then in step 5 there, we get their NTLM hash. Again, when you're connecting to a file share over the network, you have to prove that you have permissions to see that. So that'll follow a challenge response protocol. You'll reach out to me and say, hey, I want to open file.xl. And I'll say, okay, here's your challenge, 112233, and you'll take that challenge and combine it with your hash or encrypted password and send it back to me. That is, because it's a challenge response, I can't do anything with that password, but now I can take it offline and crack it. And so offline password attacks are way more successful. So an online password attack would be what I did against that OWA server at the start of the test. Every single time I submit a credential, I have to go over the network, connect to that server, authenticate, comes all the way back. Because of that, I'm only able to do about 4 to 5 password guesses a second. If I'm able to get a password offline, for example, like this one through this type of attack, that is now 30 billion password guesses a second. Again, that's just using a computer with 3 GPUs designed to be a cracking machine, and it's going much faster. So put that into context. If their password's 8 characters, no matter what it is, I'm able to brute force it, every combination of uppercase, lowercase, numbers, symbols, in less than 2 days. So that kind of goes back to choosing stronger passwords. In this particular test, their antivirus, and this is something I've seen a lot more. I'm curious to hear from you guys if you're seeing this too, but their antivirus was actually picking up on the NBNS LMR type requests. So something I haven't seen in a while, something I'm seeing a lot more of, specifically semantic endpoint protection is catching it now. For those of you who have noticed that, they are still not catching man in the middle 6. So I won't go into that, but just kind of a tidbit there. Skipping over Kerberoasting. So with the vulnerability scan, then I scan the network, and you see there in the top right that they're limiting the table to 2,500 out of 36 or 3,659 findings. So wow, that's a hospital network for you, right? So hospital networks are infamous for this. They have a major problem, and they have some systems that are running this old X-ray machine, and it cannot be updated. They have other systems where they just can't patch because they're so afraid of availability, especially in this pandemic time. They're so worried about taking a system down that they're not getting patches regularly. And so you can see here, there's a lot of vulnerabilities. Some of them are just, 55 unsupported operating systems, 40 XP machines, 35 unsupported PHPs, etc. A lot of these are have exploitable vulnerabilities behind them. Again, because we're connected to an emergency room, though, and availability is key, it was actually a much harder challenge for me to determine which host is safe for me to exploit, what is a good exploit for me to choose, because again, I don't want to bring anything down while giving them a good view of their risk. So for that, at Triaxim Security, we basically have a pretty good teamwork system where I would consult with, Schmitty or JR. We kind of come together, put our heads together, and figure out what we think is safe. In general, though, we want to consider the reputations. So all exploits have reputations associated with them. And if you search long enough and far enough, you can see, hey, people are saying, hey, I've had this problem with it, or it crashed the server this way, etc. But then also the Metasploit or Exploit DB or whatever it is will have reputation associated with it there. Second, we have to understand from a red team perspective exactly what that exploit's going to be. So obviously in this instance, I did not want to do any type of buffer overflow because again, we're corrupting memory, and if it works wrong, that's game over. And will crash the system. So also, things like MS-17010, which is famous for the WannaCry ransomware, has about a 50% chance of bringing a blue screen of death to that computer, right? Crashing it hard. So obviously those we want to avoid. And so really it's just kind of a triage effect of trying to understand how much information can I get and what can I, from that information, do I feel like it's safe enough to go forward? And so we ended up choosing a IBM WebSphere Java deserialization vulnerability. Why? Because it's application level, it's just a deserialization, and it has a very good reputation. Worked on the first try, gained access to it. From there, we dumped the contents. From there, we had obviously full control over that server. And so once I'm an administrator on a server, I can dump the contents of the local SAM file, which hosts all of the local credentials, so the local administrator. In this instance, and in a lot of our clients that we see, they are using the same local administrator account on every machine across the network. And so what that allows me to do is a pass the hash attack. So going back real quick, and I'm sorry if I'm talking fast, but going back real fast to that NBNS finding we talked about, that follows a challenge response format. So I have to know, I have to have the challenge and the response. Well, in this instance, all I have is the hashed credentials without the challenge. So no matter what challenge you give me, I have the other piece of the puzzle to do that mathematical computation to give you the response. So that's known as a pass the hash attack, where basically if I know a single, once I dump that contents of that file, I have access to every machine that has that same password. In this instance, the majority of the network. And so from there, what I would do is I use CrapMap exec to dump the contents of the LSAS process. Up top is Mimikatz. And Mimikatz used to be the gold standard, right? So you would dump the contents like wdigest and LSAS from memory. And from that, you would be able to get clear text passwords like this example font right there. Lately, that is getting caught by antivirus more and more. However, CrapMap exec will allow you to dump the contents of the LSAS process from memory. And then from that, you can some of the LSAS ones will still have clear text credentials in it. So across the whole network, again, I dumped the contents of the LSAS process. And from there, I was able to get a domain administrator type of account. Of course, I log into the domain controller to show that I have access to it. And who am I? I'm the self-service ticket account, and I'm on the Windows 2016 DC. From there, I had full access to PowerChart. So this is the same screenshot I showed you from the email, but now I am acting as a doctor or an administrator on this thing. So I can really mess with patients at this point, right? So I can change their medical records. I can, send them to the different rooms, whatever. And so this is really, PowerChart is what they primarily use for their patient management system. So that's very bad. Additionally, I can go to the HR drive, right? Because I have full control over the network as a domain administrator. So I can go to those HR folders that I don't have permissions to, give myself permissions to them. And here's a list of everybody in the hospital salary. Let me just preview this with a fact that we are in the wrong industry. We get paid pretty well, but doctors get paid a lot of money. Finally, it wouldn't be a pandemic test if I didn't show you the fact that, in the top right there, I see their situational report that lists, hey, we had 2 staff get COVID-19. Here's the precautions we're taking. And then that spreadsheet right there is exactly every patient name, medical record number, sex, date of birth, exact room they're in, what symptoms they're feeling for COVID-19. So obviously bad stuff there. How do I fix this? One, patching is important. And even if you're in a hospital, we got to find a way to get those systems up to date. For the shared administrator password, there is a free tool produced by Microsoft called Local Administrator Password Solution, and that will just automate the process of generate random accounts for that local administrator across the network. That Medium article is really good on how to prevent the clear text in memory. And then finally, segmentation. Segmentation is one of the hardest things for me to get across to a client. I would argue it's one of the most important things that they can do for their network. So segmentation essentially is like fire doors on your network. If one area of your network gets breached, the segmentation or fire doors would help it give you enough time to contain it or prevent it from going to different parts of the hospital. And so in this instance, you want to segment off your high-risk devices. So those Windows XPs we saw, the 65 of them that can't be patched or are unsupported, those should all be in their own VLAN with very tight controls of who can access that VLAN. Additionally, your domain administrators, your high priority, should be in their own VLAN. And so it's likely the IT team needs to reach out to almost every computer to administer it, but it's very unlikely that somebody in HR would ever need to catch back to a IT computer. So you can just put a one-way valve on that, segment those, put a one-way valve that they can reach out to anybody, but nobody can reach out to them. And you basically have contained, now you don't have the risk of somebody in marketing clicking on an email and your domain administrator getting compromised. Final thought here is hospitals have a real problem. So just a Google search at the time I made this briefing of the top 5 results. I searched in Google for hospital login. And the top 5 results here are 1, starting in March 2010, we're going to start doing multi-factor authentication. Well, good, but what was happening before March 2010? Additionally, you see in the top right one there, the IT help desk phone number. Again, thanks, that's more information for me. Links for employees of every login that their employees log into. Well, as an attacker, thanks for serving it up on a platter. Same thing here, and then the 5th option on my Google search here gave me an entire list of all of their support personnel for their IT team. So that's their help desk. Well, thanks. Now I can implement all those in a social engineering type of attack. And so hospitals have a need for availability. Again, they're not patching these because these systems have to be up. They can't update some of those applications or operating systems because of what's running on them. There's a crazy demand for them to have interconnectivity and sharing, right? The operating room needs to be able to send that biopsy to the lab and get the results back within minutes. And so because of that, there's this huge need for them to tie all their systems together. Additionally, you have situations where there is shared workstations. The nurses are all sharing the same computer. A lot of times they're logging in with just a shared nurses account, which kind of prevents non-repudiation, et cetera. How to solve it? I don't know. So first off, this is just something that I'm bringing to light, something I've been working on a lot, but some ideas I have are 1, segmentation or micro-segmentation. One of the things I developed and created a small business grant for is actually this device that sits in between a computer and the network that can be for these type of medical systems that can't be patched for whatever reason or can't be updated. You just put this as a man in the middle between that device and the network, and that can have antivirus and web application firewall if there's a web interface, or host-based firewall, et cetera, to really kind of block and really be a bodyguard for any communication going to that back end device. That's really risk. I also, getting rid of passwords. So, if you go to a bar and you order a drink, they swipe their thing, they maybe type in a 4-digit PIN and gain access to their systems that way. In hospitals, they're not doing that. In fact, this emergency room had every shared account called emergency 1 through 9, and the password was emergency 1 exclamation point. So, it's a real problem, but they need quick access. So with that, understand, let's switch to token-based authentication or something like that. Of course, there's a risk there of somebody stealing a token, but if you did that with a PIN or something, just something to think of. Obviously, awareness training has to count. And then, obviously hospitals are primary targets. And so their incident response needs to be better than most organizations. All right, questions. Sorry, I went a little over there.
Isbal, that was super awesome. So I focus on blue team, mostly IR type of activities. One of the things that actually occurred this past week was password spraying on an OWA account, surprisingly for a hospital. So surprise there. In that case, one of the issues was because they had basic authentication turned on for OWA, it allowed, exactly like you did, was to log into the email box and then start sleuthing through to find additional information. In that case, like in our instance, we recommended disabling basic authentication as it doesn't support things like multi-factor. Is that something that you guys are recommending or have brought up or identified?
Yeah, absolutely. So for sure. And then additionally, anything that's tied to the Active Directory, especially through basic auth, is presenting a real denial of service type vulnerability too, right? So I can purposely guess incorrect passwords and just cycle through that username list over and over and over again and lock out everybody in the hospital. That's equally bad. So yeah, absolutely.